The First World War was one of the most destructive events in Europe up until that point in history. Europe hadn't seen a conflict on a continental scale for nearly 100 years, peace having largely reigned since Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte had been exiled to St. Helena. But what became known as the Great War resulted in not only one emperor losing his throne, but three. The most famous being the abdication of the Tsar and his subsequent execution of him and his family at the hand of the Bolsheviks. The second most famous was that of the German Kaiser, who was forced into exile by his own people in the nearby Netherlands. But in fact, there was a third emperor who was almost always forgotten, Emperor Karl I, last emperor of Austria-Hungary. This is the long-forgotten tale of how the British exiled not one, but two emperors to Atlantic island prisons. But before I tell you what Emperor Karl did to deserve a fate similar to that of Napoleon, Britain's greatest enemy, we need some context. Karl Franz Joseph Ludwig Hubert George Otto Maria, or Karl for short, became the presumptive heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after his uncle, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in 1914, dying childless. By the original line of succession, Karl was extremely removed from any chance of becoming king, as he was born fifth in line to the throne. But a series of extremely tragic events made him the heir apparent. The original heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, committed double suicide with his mistress only 2 years after Karl had been born. This would have made Emperor Franz Joseph's younger brother, Maximilian, the heir apparent, but he had been killed in Mexico 20 years earlier in an ill-fated attempt to become the Emperor of Mexico. Thus, it fell to the youngest brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, who died of typhoid in 1896, making the heir apparent Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The heir presumptive then would have become Archduke Franz Ferdinand's younger brother, Otto, but he had died of syphilis in 1906, making the heir apparent Otto's son, Karl. Did everyone follow that? I barely did. Karl would become emperor during the middle of the Great War, when his granduncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, died of natural causes at the age of 86, having reigned for 68 years. Karl would only rule for 2. The Central Powers' defeat in the Great War and the subsequent implosion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire gave the young emperor no choice but to effectively abdicate, ending Karl's short reign the same day the guns fell quiet all across Europe, November 11, 1918. On that day, Karl was forced to sign a document in which he renounced all participation in the affairs of state and recognizing whatever government the future Austria would take. While very specifically wording the proclamation as to not use the word abdicate, it nonetheless was effectively that, clearly in the hopes that by not abdicating officially, he might be able to return one day to the Austrian or the Hungarian throne. Shortly after issuing this proclamation, he's recorded as having said, "I am and I will remain the rightful ruler of German Austria. I have never and will never abdicate. I would like to compare my manifesto of November 11th with a check for many thousands of crowns, which a mugger forces us to fill out at revolver point. After the army could no longer be relied on, and even the castle guard had abandoned us, I decided to sign. I don't feel bound by them at all." The day after his proclamation, the new and confusingly named Republic of German Austria was formed, and 5 days later, the First Hungarian Republic was declared, firmly distancing both countries from the monarchical rule of the Habsburgs. In March of 1919, the Black Imperial train left Austria for the final time, heading towards Switzerland, and accompanied, for their own protection, by a British officer, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Lyle Strutt. This marks the first direct British intervention on affairs in the lands of what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it wouldn't be the last. On orders from His Majesty King George V, Strutt was sent to protect the Austrian royal family on their way out of Austria. Keeping in mind, the two countries were bitter enemies not months before, this is a surprising show of goodwill from the British, but the move makes more sense when viewed from King George's perspective. He had just watched his relatives be brutally executed by the Bolsheviks not a year before as their own monarchy had collapsed. There was a real fear that it could happen again. On March 24th, the Imperial train came to a stop in the last Austrian town of Feldkirch just before the tracks crossed into Liechtenstein and then on to Switzerland. At this stop, the dethroned emperor, while still in Austrian territory, officially repudiated his supposed abdication in what became known as the Feldkirch Manifesto. In this document, he officially stated that he had not abdicated and any action taken counter to that by the Austrian government was null and void for me and my house. He then thus departed into exile, leaving Austria, still claiming he had a right to the thrones of Austria and Hungary, which his family had held for 700 and 400 years respectively. This belligerent stance, clearly meant to set up a future return to the Austrian or Hungarian throne, would set up events for the next several years. The Austrian Republic was not very happy when they found out. and swiftly responded to this overt provocation against their new republic 10 days later by officially dethroning the entire House of Habsburg, confiscating all of their property in Austria, abolishing nobility completely, and exiling the Habsburgs in perpetuity. Charles was personally banned from ever returning from Austria, and any other Habsburgs had to renounce their claim to the throne and accept status as a private citizen before ever being allowed to return. Even as late as 1995, the last emperor's grandsons were still not allowed to enter Austria due to them having not renounced their claims to the Austrian throne, giving them the curious effect of having Austrian passports but not being allowed to enter Austria. Eventually, after nearly 70 years, the laws were amended to be slightly more lenient to allow them to return. Crucially, all of this complicated banishing of the Habsburgs had only taken place in one of the kingdoms Karl laid claim to. Hungary had yet to bar him from the throne. Thus, Karl went into exile, fully bent on returning to either of his thrones in the future. During the summer of 1919, it soon became clear to the once emperor that his best hope in reclaiming his throne lay with the crown of St. Stephen in Budapest. With the current political chaos in Hungary, as well as them not having explicitly banished the Habsburgs like Austria had, made Hungary an ideal place for his restoration. After the collapse of the communist regime under Bela Kun, which is definitely a tale for another time, on March 1st, 1920, the Hungarian National Assembly voted to re-establish the Kingdom of Hungary and assign a regent to the throne, but crucially, did not invite Karl to retake his crown. The elected regent was the once Vice Admiral Miklos Horthy. The admiral, having returned to his native, now landlocked country, he had commanded the armies that helped remove the communists from Budapest. On his assumption as regent of the kingdom, he sent word to his supposed king in which he assured the monarch of his unshakable loyalty, of his conviction that Karl's restoration would come, and of his intention in the meantime to report fully on events in the homeland. He even begged special permission to be allowed to move into a side tract of the royal palace, as this was, after all, his master's house. Despite past promises and oaths made to Karl, Horthy would ignore Karl's request to prepare the way for his return, and also ignore queries about when he should arrive to assume the throne. Horthy's further disloyalty to his former master was considered confirmed after he compelled the Hungarian armed forces to swear allegiance to him and not to the king or the Habsburgs. Despite the obvious signs that the current ruler of Hungary was at the very least non-committal, if not downright opposed to letting the king come back, by the end of the summer, Karl had decided to return soon to Hungary at all costs, with or without the invitation of his enigmatic regent. With the peace conference ended and the term set for Hungary, meaning his restoration attempts would not lead to a potentially even worse peace settlement, the deposed monarch started reaching out for help. If he wanted to retake the throne, he knew he would need the support, even if only diplomatically, of one of the great powers. In the end, he found support amongst the French. Aristide Briand, who had become prime minister for the 4th time out of a total of 6, as well as simultaneously holding the post of foreign minister, pledged to support Karl, if the bid to claim the throne succeeded. The French were hoping to restore a strong counter towards Germany from the south, in addition to their support of Czechoslovakia and Poland. Crucially, it is important to mention, all of this was later denied by Briand after Karl failed. As all the conversations had been verbal agreements between the French and the former emperor's representatives, it is hard to say who was telling the truth, but the logic holds that Karl wouldn't have acted without a great power's support. And there's some evidence showing that they were involved. Another very surprising and almost mundane obstacle to returning to Hungary from his exile in Switzerland was the fact that the emperor did not have a passport, which is also incidentally true of the British monarch. It is a crucial example of French support as well. The French helped procure him a passport and also encouraged his departure to retake his throne. How we know this is even stranger. The British officer Colonel Strutt, who had been sent to protect the family on their journey to Switzerland and had since left, now comes back into the story. Vacationing in Switzerland during the winter of 1921, he once again took part in events. This time he acted as a go-between, going to Paris to acquire the passport the French had promised the emperor, actions for which, when reported to the British Foreign Office, he was duly castigated for acting independently in essentially a plot to overthrow the government of Hungary and returning a once enemy monarch to the throne. With the assistance and prompting of the French government, on the 24th of March, 1921, Karl left Prangen's castle, his Lake Geneva estate, and headed for the French border. He was on his way to reclaim his throne, or so he thought. The travels that took him from Switzerland to Budapest were a journey worthy of a spy novel, and as what one author described as being in the best tradition of a Central European adventure. On Easter Friday, March 25th, he reached the French border and crossed on foot, setting in motion an elaborate set of travel arrangements. At the border, he was met by car, which drove him on to Strasbourg, where he caught the Paris to Vienna train, where he had a special sleeping compartment waiting for him. On board, he met a Spanish nobleman who would be his companion for the rest of the trip, as well as giving credence to the Spanish diplomatic passport to which the French had given Karl earlier. In a show of how committed the French were to the affair, the passport in the name of one Sanchez had been issued by the Spanish consulate in Paris, stamped by the head of the 3rd Division of the Paris Prefecture of Police, and furnished with Czech and German visas from the Paris passport office of these two countries, as well as the 3rd visa from the German-Austrian legation in France. When the train crossed into Austria, the once emperor had to enter his own former empire wearing a disguise and staying confined to his own compartment, lest he risked discovery. Arriving at the Westbahnhof in Vienna at 10:50 p.m., he then took a regular Viennese taxi to his old friend and ally's Vienna residence to stay the night. This was the only night Karl would ever spend in Vienna after he was exiled. The next day, they used 2 former imperial chauffeurs to take them to the Hungarian border, where the former emperor now presented himself as William Koto, an official of the English Red Cross. At 10 p.m. on the evening of March 26th, the emperor arrived at the Bishop of Sothenbelly's residence and announced his presence. One member of the Hungarian cabinet was already in attendance, and by luck, the prime minister was found to be only 20 minutes away and brought over immediately, arriving at 4:30 in the morning. Despite the arrival and pledge of support of Colonel Lahar, who controlled the troops in the western region of Hungary, the prime minister urged moderation and that the king should move on Budapest peacefully and that Horthy would step down peacefully when he saw the king. Eventually, it was decided the prime minister and the other minister who was in attendance would leave an hour before the emperor to announce the arrival of the monarch to Horthy and clear the air, Karl to follow an hour later to make his triumphal arrival and subsequently take the throne. At 6:30 a.m. on Easter Sunday, the 2 ministers set out for Budapest, followed an hour later by the king. At 2 p.m., the king arrived in front of what was once his palace in Budapest, but ominously, there was no one to greet him. No one presented arms, nobody waved flags, and nobody, in fact, seemed to realize he was even in the country. Unbeknownst to him, the prime minister's car had either broken down, gotten lost, or deliberately did not go, depending on the source. The important part being that the king had arrived unannounced to retake his throne from a regent who was not willing to give it up. What followed was the first meeting between the king emperor and former vice admiral for 3 years. In the king's former office, now the regent's, the two debated the future of Hungary for the next 2 hours. Karl demanded the regent turn over power to him and reminded him of his oaths of loyalty, while the regent insisted those oaths were now null and void, and that, in any matter, the time was not right for the return of the king. Without the support of the prime minister, and not having brought any troops with him, and having even left his revolver behind, the king was quite literally alone and defenseless, surrounded by his now archenemy and all of his supporters. In his desperation, Karl even revealed to Horthy that he had the support of the French prime minister. Although this news apparently shook Horthy, Karl was only able to get vague assurances that the regent may hand over power in the future when the time was right. Utterly defeated, he left the palace and went back to the bishop's residence in western Hungary. After a war of words over telegrams sent between all the great powers who had now been alerted by Horthy to the French and Karl's plans, and between Karl and Horthy themselves, Horthy had surrounded the bishop's palace with troops, and the opportunity had passed. Karl was thus duly escorted out of Hungary, back through Austria, and once again on through Feldkirch station to Switzerland, this time with a French, Italian, and British escort of troops. What became known as the Easter bid, for having taken place over Easter weekend, had failed. But it also has another name, the first attempt. Plans for a second, last-ditch effort began almost immediately. This version was to be bolder and more forceful than the first, which had resulted in the emperor essentially begging for his crown from his supposed regent. 2 major problems now presented themselves. Did they still have the backing of the French, and how would they get to Hungary a second time? The French, in fact, were surprisingly still open to giving Karl another shot at attempting to retake the throne, even strengthening communication and ties between the two parties after the first debacle of an attempt. In regards to travel, they had burned all the bridges on land, as now the Austrian and Hungarian authorities were on high alert to watch for the emperor. Thus, it was decided they would take the risky option of flying from Switzerland to Hungary. Keep in mind, the first plane had only been flown less than 20 years before, and the emperor had never even flown in his life. They recruited 3 Hungarian loyalist pilots and one who had a great flight record from the war, and hired a 6-seat Junkers F-13 monoplane in Zurich. They also wanted to make a second attempt as soon as possible, as after the first attempt, Horthy had started purging the army and civil service of suspected legitimists. This time was of the essence. This time, accompanied by the Empress as well, who insisted on going despite being pregnant, the couple sneaked out of their Swiss lodgings to an airport outside of Zurich for their flight to Hungary. Thus, on the 20th of October, 1921, only months after his first failed bid, the two royals took flight for the first time in their lives to try and reclaim their throne. In a flight where the weather was apparently perfect, as they flew over Austria, the emperor was able to view his former empire from above. He was even able to spot the castle where he was born. After landing safely in Hungary, the royal couple went to Sopron. Okay, we're just heads up, we're about to hear a lot of Hungarian names that I can't pronounce. Went to Sopron, where they set up camp and met the ministers who would make up the king's new government, as well as the divisions of loyal troops who were waiting for them. The party, now accompanied by troops and loyal ministers, boarded multiple trains and started off towards Budapest in what has been described as a triumphal ceremonial procession through the countryside. They stopped at all the towns and villages on their way to Budapest, receiving cheering crowds and troops presenting arms. A much different welcome than the last time the king had returned. When they reached Győr, despite a warm reception from the soldiers, the local garrison commander reported to Budapest and Horthy what was happening. This was the first word Horthy had that something was afoot. Horthy immediately sent orders to all the garrisons between Győr and Budapest to fire on the train, but in fact, most of the garrisons went over to the king. The train arrived at the outskirts of Budapest, only miles from Palace Hill, on the 23rd of October. In the neighborhoods around the train tracks that led into Budapest, in what could only be described as a small standoff rather than even a small battle took place, where troops loyal to Horthy stopped the king's advance towards the palace. With a fair amount of double-dealing, some of the king's generals soon turned on him, and the whole episode was effectively over as fast as it had begun, the king and all of his men surrounded. The king actually managed to escape by having the train reverse out of the suburbs, but it was effectively over. He was able to spend one last night treated as a monarch on his own soil when Count Esterházy offered him lodging at his castle in Totis, a touching gesture from one of the oldest and most well-known imperial Hungarian nobility. They had been Joseph Haydn's patron, for example. But Horthy soon caught up and imprisoned him and his entourage, awaiting word from the Allied powers on what to do. The Allies, who had gathered in Paris to decide what to do with the ex-emperor king, who is now seen as a troublemaker for attempting to destabilize and overthrow a government in the now recently peaceful Balkans, France had, of course, quickly denounced and denied it had any involvement after the plot had failed, and now agreed that Karl needed to be removed from Hungary. The Allies eventually decided that the Hungarian government was invited to hand over the king's person to the British naval Danube flotilla presently in Budapest, from which he would then be spirited to the Black Sea and put on a British cruiser. After a debate in the British cabinet on the 26th of October on where to exile their new prisoner, it was decided he would be temporarily housed in Gibraltar rather than Malta, pending the decision as to his permanent home. They went on to discuss where that permanent home would be, indicating the Allies had been in discussion with Spain to place him on one of their islands either in the Balearics or the Canaries. Ultimately, neither was chosen, and he was sent to the Portuguese island of Madeira. Although Napoleon is never mentioned, there is no doubt that the British cabinet was thinking of the precedent as they were deciding where to put him, as they decided that, in any case, an island was desirable, and that the majority of those present were opposed to Great Britain becoming his jailer, which clearly ruled out imprisoning him on some British island, St. Helena. And also knowing that one of those cabinet members in attendance, Secretary of State for the Colonies, none other than Winston Churchill, an avid historian and admirer of Napoleon who would have known the parallels between the events he was partaking in those of almost precisely a century before, especially considering, just as Napoleon had broken out of exile to reclaim his throne, that is precisely what Karl had done, not once, but twice. Thus, the apparent punishment for a rogue ex-emperor who tries to reclaim his throne is exile to an island. While I could find no records online detailing an official recognition of what they were doing to Karl was a direct precedent from Napoleonic times, and while it's heavily implied, the press at the time certainly did recognize it as such, repeatedly mentioning Napoleon as being the precedent. On November 19th, 1921, the former royal couple arrived at Funchal, the largest city and port of the small island of Madeira. The rest of the family then joined them the following February. Karl's time on the island was, however, extremely short-lived and he would never leave. On the 9th of March, he caught a cold that would eventually result in a case of severe pneumonia. He died on the 1st of April, 1922, at the age of 34, with his eldest 9-year-old son, Crown Prince Otto, and his wife, Zita, by his side. Unlike Karl, both of them would live extremely long lives. Zita would not die until 1989, aged 96, never having remarried, while their son Otto, notably who later renounced his right to the throne, would live until 2011, dying at the age of 98. Oh, and what happened to Horthy, you ask? He himself had to flee into exile after the Germans invaded Hungary during the Second World War, and also died in exile in Portugal. Funny how the world works sometimes.